The mind, is it a barrier or a bridge? The bed of a lake, even if dry and cracked, may quickly fill up when there's a source of water available. Whether that water comes from the rain or from a river or a stream, or perhaps a man-made canal, it makes no difference. Once the lake is completely full, it then begins to overflow into the surrounding areas to accommodate more water. We can compare the mind to a lake. When we first arrived as newborns, the mind came just like a dry lake bed, completely empty and full of potential, ready to accept from the external world all its contents. Just as rivers, streams, the rain, and canals that may fill up a lake, the five senses fill up the mind with sensations, impressions, sights and sounds, smells, and various tastes that we encounter during our day-to-day existence. And the mind overflows when this incoming sensory information exceeds the capacity of the conscious mind. Where there is water, it is easy to find life. Water is the most essential ingredient for life. We can walk on a dry lake bed, but once it's full of water, we cannot reach the bottom of the lake that easily. If we want to go to the middle of the lake, we must know how to swim, or we must have a boat with us. Thoughts float in the mind just as fish float in the water. Thoughts bring life to the mind. Fish in the lake have nowhere in particular to go, yet they constantly roam from one part of the lake to another. Likewise, thoughts move back and forth, in and out of the conscious stream, sometimes disappearing for days, weeks, even years at times before they resurface again. Once the mind begins to fill up with thoughts and all the experiences we go through on a day-to-day basis, we cannot easily get to the bottommost layer of the mind, that empty, dry bed that we came with when we were born. Everybody is forced to swim in the mind. We spend much of our time surviving the unpredictable waters of the mind. Our natural inner evolution that is separate from the physical body and its mode of evolution passes through several phases. The phase of the dry lake bed at birth, the phase of a lake full of water which can resemble the adult mind filled with sensory impressions, but until the surface of the lake-like mind can be made completely still during our waking consciousness, the mind continues to remain a barrier and not a bridge. The mind evolves into a bridge that takes us further along the inward journey when the mind can hold all the reflections of the world as if it appears in its native state without the influence or contamination of the stream of thoughts. When the mind goes from a barrier to a bridge, our awareness can either be independent of the mind, by which it becomes expansive, or it may condense into the limited form that fits within the boundaries of the mind. We may ask this question: where were the fish when the lake was once dry? Where did they come from when the lake filled up with water? And where will the fish go when the lake dries up again? When we apply this question to the mind and our thoughts, replacing the mind for the lake and thoughts for the fish, it gives us a different perspective, a wider perspective of the mind from the first breath to the last breath. This question also helps us step away from the mind, creating a separation as if we are standing on the bank of a lake and looking into the waters. Before we arrived here, where were our thoughts? And when we leave here, where do they go? We may not be able to answer this question to our full satisfaction, But it does highlight an important point, the ephemeral nature of the mind. The question becomes a mechanism or a device which can probe the nature and the reality of the mind itself. Without looking for an answer, by persisting with this question and letting it linger and soak all our doubts, beliefs, concepts, ideas, and projections, differences will begin to melt, and the invisible streak of unity that underlies the differences amongst thoughts may then appear to us. Such deep questions we ask of ourselves, when done in the utter silence of our being and not as an intellectual exercise that we verbalize, becomes like the end of a fishing line holding a bait that sits in the water. When fish nibble on the bait, immediately the patient fisherman at the other end of the line becomes alert and ready. When we drop a question, a deep question into our being, and silently become aware, without looking for answers, answers may then nibble on our questions in the form of a deep intuitive understanding. If we remain alert, we can readily bring that understanding into our conscious realm. We may not be able to translate intuitive understanding into exact words, but the understanding expresses itself and comes to the surface of the mind in one form or another. Without us knowing, it then begins to transform us, and this transformation takes place from deep within ourselves. As we cannot visualize everything that happens under the surface of a lake, all the marine life that come and go, their movements and activities are happening under the waters, which we cannot see. We cannot see what happens under the surface of the conscious mind. Inner transformation comes as a vague but perhaps a distinct feeling of oneness, perhaps joy, bliss for no reason. And if it's true, it should not leave us. The more we work on the surface of the mind through watchfulness, becoming a pure witness to all that goes on in the mind, greater is the depth and the speed with which the inner transformation takes place. Fish have a natural adaptation to live and breathe underwater. Water forms their boundaries, the boundaries of their existence, whether it's a vast ocean or a tiny pond. Likewise, thoughts can live indefinitely as discrete forms in the mind. Although we don't understand the basis or how thought forms come about, we perceive them. They are in our direct perception. Their boundaries are limited to the field of energy we may call the mind. Unlike fish, we cannot breathe underwater. We cannot physically go underwater and breathe. We need a special apparatus that supplies oxygen and keeps us alive when we go deep underwater. Like scuba divers who enter an alien world encased in their protective suits with piped oxygen that comes from cylinders strapped to their backs. Once divers leave the unnatural world of water, breathing becomes easy and effortless, and they don't even think about it. But as long as they are underwater, they will have to measure their breaths, keep a check on their oxygen supplies, and watch the level of the oxygen in their tanks. Likewise, the mind is not a natural place for our sense of being when it begins to function as a pure witness. Our level of awareness is somewhere between the surface of the mind, the superficial rumblings in the mind, and this deep sense of being that sits in silence. To raise our level of awareness and enter and remain in the witnessing state may feel unnatural at first, but it becomes more comfortable, and it's comforting to keep our awareness as a pure witness compared to becoming an active participant in the unpredictable and undulating world of the mind with its thoughts that come and go. Practicing being in a witnessing state brings about clarity and calmness. Nothing can then easily ruffle that sense of peace and calm. As soon as we leave the witnessing state, the sense of being, which gathers into the whole, quickly fragments. Our attention goes with the fragment of that being that dives deep into the mind each morning, where we remain until it's time to fall asleep again and exit the mind. Some are able to adapt better to the mind than others. But deep down, there's a silent understanding in all that the world of thoughts does not constitute the natural surroundings of our sense of being. To survive in the mind for an indefinite period of time, this fragmented sense of being cannot remain naked and free. It needs something, it needs a cover. So it covers itself with the protective suit of the ego. Thoughts recognize the ego as their master, and the ego easily blends amongst thoughts. When we become identified with the ego, all the doors in the conscious mind are open to us. Every thought becomes open to us. Thoughts begin to seek us. Even as we become seekers of thoughts and experiences, there's a constant yearning and seeking that goes on in the mind. Soon the one who wears this protective sleeve of the ego is forgotten, and we become essentially one with the ego. We're identified with that. The world of the mind and thought then become our waking reality, which we can not easily get away from. Silence is the natural backdrop for the sense of being, not this world of thoughts, whether they're busy or light. Just as we cannot find pockets of air underwater, we cannot find absolute silence in the mind. In the mind, it may appear quiet, but the quietude of the mind is highly relative. It is usually in comparison to a busy flurry of thoughts that may have just gone by in the preceding few moments. When the mind becomes overloaded, we begin to long for some silence, some emptiness within. The mind can never return back to its original state as a dry, empty bed full of potential, just as it was when we were born. It is already full. And so full that just a little more information and it could tip the balance towards the dangers of sensory excesses. A dry lake bed does not reflect anything, but once it fills with water, and if that body of water is completely still, there may then appear an exact replica of the clouds that are going overhead. The inner journey then reaches an important milestone when the mind can become steady, reflective, and absolutely still as a mirror. We, as the bystander of such a mind, a reflective mind, can look at both the reflection on the surface of the mind and what's reflecting upon the mind from the outside. In that silence, we enjoy the oneness of that picture, yet the separateness of that picture. When we look at the world or its image in the mind, there's no difference. The bystander, the witness within, intuitively knows that the reflection is unreal, and what is reflected upon the lake of the mind keeps changing. Us, being the observer, the witness, we remain changeless as we continue to observe the change. This perspective is not there or cannot be there when the lake is either dry or its waters are turbulent. A mind full of life, yet calm and reflective, is an indestructible bridge and not an insurmountable barrier.